blood on marble. It's a sight that haunts you. When Camilla Hastings dove in front of the Russo matriarch, absorbing 5 rounds from a suppressed weapon, the underworld held its breath. But the real tragedy wasn't the gunfire, it was the devastating secret she bled out on that ballroom floor. The Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston had seen its fair share of high society events, but the annual St. Jude's Winter Gala on December 12th was supposed to be a neutral ground. In the city's intricate and ruthless underworld, a truce was implicitly understood whenever the city's wealthy gathered for charity. Cassian Russo, the 33-year-old, undisputed head of the Russo syndicate, relied on that unspoken rule. He had brought his mother, Isabella Russo, to the event to celebrate her recent recovery from a mild stroke, and by Isabella's side, as always, was Camilla Hastings. Camilla was a 26-year-old cardiovascular nurse, hired exclusively by the Russo family 6 months prior to monitor Isabella's health. She was an outsider to their dark world, a woman with a radiant, unassuming smile, soft hazel eyes, and a quiet resilience that had instantly endeared her to the aging Mafia matriarch. Isabella loved Camilla like a daughter. She knew nothing of the blood money that paid her salary. She only knew the warmth of the Russo home, or at least, that was what everyone believed. The ballroom was a masterpiece of winter elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the attendees, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the champagne flutes held by Boston's elite. A string quartet in the corner played a haunting rendition of Vivaldi's Winter. Cassian stood by the mahogany bar, nursing a glass of bourbon. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the room, landing momentarily on the Croft family, his fiercest rivals in the port smuggling trade. Bastian Croft gave Cassian a curt, mocking nod from across the room. Cassian didn't return it. Instead, his gaze drifted back to Camilla. She was wearing a deep emerald silk dress that cascaded perfectly over her frame, adjusting the shawl around Isabella's shoulders. When Camilla looked up and caught Cassian's eye, a subtle, almost imperceptible flush crept up her neck. What the underworld didn't know, what even the sharp-eyed Isabella hadn't realized, was that Cassian Russo, the ruthless boss who had built an empire on fear and precision, was completely and utterly in love with his mother's nurse. For 4 months, they had been meeting in secret. Stolen moments in the dimly lit library of the Russo estate, hushed phone calls at 3 a.m, and desperate, breathless promises of a future far away from the violence of Boston. Camilla was the only light in Cassian's suffocatingly dark life. "You're staring, Cassian," his underboss, Leo, murmured, stepping up beside him. "People will notice. Let them." Cassian replied quietly, though he forced his eyes away, staring instead at the amber liquid in his glass. "Is the perimeter secure? Airtight?" Leo assured him. "Bastian's men check their weapons at the door. No one gets in without passing our security. But in a world built on betrayal, airtight is an illusion." It happened at exactly 10:14 p.m. The quartet was transitioning into a new movement. A waiter in a crisp white uniform, carrying a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, approached the table where Isabella and Camilla were seated. Cassian, trained by a lifetime of paranoia, noticed the subtle anomalies. The waiter's grip on the tray was too tight, his eyes too hyper-focused, his footsteps completely silent against the marble. Cassian pushed away from the bar. "Leo." Before the name fully left his mouth, the waiter dropped the silver tray. The clattering crash echoed through the ballroom, masking the deadly, metallic click of a suppressed Mac. 1-0 submachine gun being drawn from beneath the waiter's tailored jacket. The weapon was raised, the red dot of a laser sight painting a target directly over Isabella Russo's heart. Time seemed to fracture into jagged, agonizingly slow shards. Cassian drew his weapon, sprinting across the ballroom, screaming his mother's name. But he was 40 feet away. He was too late. Camilla, sitting to Isabella's right, saw the laser. She didn't scream, she didn't freeze. In a split second, driven by an instinct older and deeper than fear, she threw her entire body weight sideways, violently tackling the 60-year-old matriarch to the floor just as the assassin pulled the trigger. Twip, 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 twip. The suppressed shots sounded like the violent snapping of a thick whip. They were meant to tear through Isabella's chest. Instead, they found Camila. The first bullet shattered her right collarbone. The second and third tore through her ribs, violently missing her heart by millimeters. The fourth buried itself deep in her abdomen. And the fifth grazed the side of her neck, slicing the skin and sending a spray of crimson across the pristine white tablecloth. Camila collapsed over Isabella, her emerald dress instantly darkening with her blood. Chaos erupted. Screams shattered the elegant music. The ballroom became a stampede of terrified socialites, slipping on dropped champagne. Cassian reached the table a fraction of a second after Leo put 2 bullets into the assassin's skull, dropping the fake waiter instantly. But Cassian didn't look at the dead man. He dropped to his knees, his tailored suit sliding in the expanding pool of blood on the marble. "Camila!" Cassian roared, his voice cracking in a way his men had never heard. He grabbed her shoulders, gently rolling her off his weeping mother. Isabella was shaking violently, clutching her face. She jumped. "Cassian!" She jumped in front of me. Camilla's eyes were half open, hazy and unfocused. Blood bubbled at the corner of her pale lips. Cassian pressed his large, trembling hands frantically against the wounds on her chest and abdomen, trying in vain to stem the catastrophic bleeding. The blood was warm, soaking through his fingers, staining his white cuffs. "Look at me, Cammy. Look at me," he pleaded. The cold Mafia facade entirely shattered. He was just a man watching his world bleed out. "Stay with me. The ambulance is coming." Camilla's hand twitched. Her blood-stained fingers reached up, weakly gripping the lapel of Cassian's jacket. Her breathing was a ragged, wet gasp. She tried to speak, her voice a fragile whisper against the noise of the screaming ballroom. "Cass," she breathed, a tear slipping down her temple. The baby." Cassian froze. The world around him, the sirens in the distance, his mother's sobbing. Leo, shouting orders, evaporated into a deafening silence. "What?" he whispered, his heart stopping. Camilla's eyes rolled back, her grip on his jacket going completely slack. She slipped into unconsciousness, leaving Cassian kneeling in her blood, the echo of her final 2 words destroying everything he thought he knew. The emergency bay of Massachusetts General Hospital was a blinding assault of fluorescent lights and sterile, terrifying efficiency. The doors blasted open, and paramedics rushed the gurney through, shouting medical jargon that sounded like a death sentence to the men following them. 26-year-old female, multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. Massive hemorrhaging, blood pressure is 60/40, and dropping. "We need a massive transfusion protocol. Stat." Cassian walked beside the gurney, his face pale, his hands coated in drying, rust-colored blood. He looked like a ghost, haunting his own life. "Sir, you can't come back here," a nurse shouted, physically blocking Cassian as the trauma team wheeled Camila into Trauma Bay 1. "Move," Cassian growled, a lethal, hollow threat. "Cassian, stop." Leo grabbed his boss's shoulders, hauling him back. 2 of Russo's heavily armed guards stepped up, forming a barrier between the hospital staff and their volatile boss. "Let them work. If you go in there, you'll only distract them. She needs them right now." Cassian stood trembling in the hallway as the heavy doors of the trauma bay swung shut. He looked down at his hands. They were stained deep red. Camilla's blood. The blood of the woman he loved, and the blood of a child he hadn't even known existed. The baby. The words echoed in his skull like a tolling bell. She was pregnant. How far along? Why hadn't she told him? The crushing weight of realization hit him. She hadn't told him because she was terrified. She was carrying the heir to the most dangerous crime syndicate in Boston. And she knew what that meant. It meant a life of targets on their backs. A life where her child would never be safe. Yet, despite that fear, she had thrown herself into the line of fire to save the woman who would have been her child's grandmother. Isabella arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by a small army of Russo enforcers. The matriarch was pale, her velvet gown stained with Camilla's blood. When she saw Cassian pacing the waiting room like a caged animal, she hurried to him, wrapping her arms around his rigid frame. "She saved my life, Cassian." Isabella wept into his shoulder. That sweet, innocent girl. "She took those bullets for me." "Why would she do that?" she owed me nothing. Cassian couldn't bring himself to speak. He just held his mother, staring blankly at the double doors of the surgical wing. Hours bled into one another. Dr. Samuel Jennett, the chief of trauma, was a veteran surgeon who had patched up countless gang members and mobsters over his 30-year career. But when he finally emerged through the surgical doors at 3:45 a.m., his face was ashen, his green scrubs dark with sweat and blood. Cassian was across the room in a fraction of a second. "Tell me she's alive." Dr. Jennett pulled off his surgical cap, letting out a long, heavy exhale. He looked at Cassian, then at Isabella. "Mr. Russo, Mrs. Russo, please sit down." "I am not sitting down," Cassian said, his voice vibrating with dangerous, raw desperation. "Tell me." "Camila is currently in the ICU. She survived the surgery," Dr. Jennett started. Isabella let out a loud, breathless sob of relief, clutching her chest. But Cassian didn't relax. He saw the grim set of the doctor's jaw. He saw the but. Dr. Jennett continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. The damage was catastrophic. The bullet that entered her abdomen shredded her liver and severed her uterine artery. She went into hypovolemic shock on the table twice. We had to perform a massive blood transfusion and an emergency exploratory laparotomy to stop the internal bleeding. Dr. Jennett paused, looking directly into Cassian's eyes. During the ultrasound, to locate the hemorrhaging, we discovered she was 10 weeks pregnant. Isabella gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She stared at the doctor in absolute shock and then slowly turned her head to look at her son. Cassian's face was a mask of pure agony. Isabella immediately understood. The secret meetings, the changed demeanor in her son, the soft looks exchanged across the room. To save Camilla's life, to stop her from bleeding to death on the table, Dr. Jennett swallowed hard. We had to perform an emergency hysterectomy. The bullet tore through the uterus. "I am so deeply sorry, Mr. Russo. We couldn't save the child. And Camila, she will never be able to have children." The silence that fell over the waiting room was absolute. It was a suffocating, crushing vacuum. Cassian backed up a step. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The impenetrable armor of the Mafia boss completely shattered, leaving behind a broken man. He pressed the heels of his blood-stained hands against his eyes, but the tears leaked out anyway. Hot and relentless, he let out a low, guttural sound. A sound of profound, unbearable grief that ripped through the sterile hallway, leaving every hardened guard in the room looking away, blinking back their own tears. Isabella fell into a chair, openly sobbing, mourning the loss of a grandchild she never knew she had, and grieving for the young woman who had sacrificed her own future to save hers. "She's in a medically induced coma," Dr. Jennett added softly. "Her body has been through an unimaginable trauma. If she wakes up, she is going to need you, Mr. Russo. She is going to need you more than she ever has. If she wakes up," Cassian dropped his hands. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now burning with a mixture of profound heartbreak and a terrifying, lethal rage. The sadness was for Camila. The rage was for the men who put her there. "Can I see her?" Cassian choked out. "Only for a few minutes," Jennett replied. Cassian walked through the doors into the ICU. Room 4 was dimly lit. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of the ventilator, the only sound. Camila looked incredibly small in the center of the bed. Tubes ran down her throat, IV lines were taped to her pale arms, and thick white bandages wrapped tightly around her chest and neck. He pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down. He carefully took her cold, limp hand in his, pressing his forehead against her knuckles. "I'm so sorry, amore mio," he whispered into the dark room, his tears falling onto her skin. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm so sorry about our baby." He sat there in the darkness for a long time, the weight of her sacrifice pressing down on him. She had lost their child, lost her ability to be a mother, all to protect his family. As he held her hand, a dangerous vow crystallized in his mind. The tears stopped, replaced by a chilling resolve. Cassian stood up, kissing her forehead gently. When he walked back out into the waiting room, the grieving father was gone. The boss of the Russo syndicate had returned. He looked at Leo, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Mobilize everyone. Tell them to arm up," Cassian ordered, his eyes dead and terrifying. "We're going to war, and Bastian Croft is going to drown in his own blood before the sun comes up." The clock on the dashboard of the armored black Cadillac Escalade glowed a harsh 4:18 a.m. Outside, a freezing Boston rain lashed against the tinted windows, turning the neon lights of the Seaport district into smeared streaks of red and yellow. Cassian sat in the back, a suppressed Sig Sauer P-226 resting on his thigh. His tuxedo shirt was still stained with Camilla's drying blood, a deliberate choice. He wanted Bastian Croft to see exactly what he was dying for. "We're 2 minutes out from Atlantic Horizon Logistics," Leo announced from the passenger seat, racking the slide of his customized M4 carbine. "Sullivan's sniper team has the roof covered. Croft's men are lightly staffed tonight." The gala gave them a false sense of security. "No survivors," Cassian replied, his voice a flat, dead baritone that sent a chill even down Leo's spine. "If they are in that building, they belong to the Earth now." Atlantic Horizon Logistics was a sprawling brick warehouse on Fargo Street, serving as the front for the Croft family's port smuggling operations. By 4:22 a.m., the heavy steel reinforced doors were breached with C-4 plastic explosives. The concussive blast shattered the pre-dawn quiet, sending a shockwave of heat and pulverized brick into the freezing rain. Cassian walked through the smoke like the Grim Reaper incarnate. He didn't flinch as gunfire erupted inside the cavernous warehouse. His men moved with lethal, militaristic precision. It wasn't a firefight. It was an extermination. He found Bastian Croft in the glass-enclosed manager's office on the second-floor catwalk. The older man was frantically trying to load a gold-plated revolver when Cassian kicked the reinforced glass door off its hinges. Before Bastian could raise his weapon, Cassian fired twice. The hollow-point rounds shattered Bastian's kneecaps. The rival boss collapsed, screaming in agony, dropping the revolver. Cassian stepped into the office, the crunch of broken glass loud under his dress shoes. He kicked the gun away and grabbed Bastian by his expensive silk tie, hauling him halfway up. "My mother," Cassian snarled, pressing the searing hot barrel of the Sig Sauer directly against Bastian's forehead. "You violated the truce. You sent a shooter to the Street Jude Gala to kill my mother. Why?" Bastian was hyperventilating, blood pouring from his shattered legs, pooling on the cheap office carpet. But as he looked up into Cassian's bloodshot, murderous eyes, a twisted, agonized laugh bubbled up from his throat. He coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto Cassian's shoes. You think I ordered that hit?" Bastian wheezed, his face pale with impending shock. "I deal in narcotics and stolen freight, Russo. I don't give a damn about your mother. Killing an old lady at a charity event? That brings the FBI. That's bad for business." Cassian's jaw tightened. He pressed the gun harder. "Don't lie to me. The shooter was carrying a Mac. 10 traced back to a shipment you brought through the docks last month." "Yeah, I brought them in," Bastian screamed, clutching his ruined knees. "And I sold them. To your own flesh and blood." "You blind fool." The air in the office suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. Cassian froze. "What?" "Ask him." Bastian choked out, a cruel, dying smile spreading across his face. "Ask your cousin. Ask Matteo why he bought untraceable weapons from me last week. The old lady was pushing you to take the family legitimate." "Cassian, she was cutting off our cash flow." Matteo didn't want the Croft family dead. He wanted a partnership. And Isabella was in the way. The betrayal hit Cassian with the physical force of a freight train. Matteo, his father's brother's son. The man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral. The man who had dined at their table every Sunday. Matteo had orchestrated the assassination attempt. He had hired the hitman, knowing Cassian would automatically blame the Crofts, triggering a war that would leave Matteo perfectly positioned to pick up the pieces. Cassian slowly stood up, looking down at the bleeding rival boss. "You sold him the gun that put my girl in a coma," Cassian whispered, the grief returning to curdle his rage. "Russo, wait, I just told you the truth." Cassian didn't wait. He pulled the trigger, painting the frosted glass behind Bastian with a spray of crimson. The warehouse fell dead silent, the gunfire below having ceased. Leo jogged up the metal stairs, his face smeared with soot. "Building is clear, boss. Croft is done." "Croft was a pawn," Cassian said, his voice hollow as he holstered his weapon. He turned to Leo, his eyes burning with an entirely new, deeply terrifying kind of sorrow. "It was Matteo. Matteo ordered the hit." Leo's breath hitched. "Matteo? Boss." "He's family." "Not anymore," Cassian said, stepping over Bastian's body. "He took my child from me. Find him, Leo. Find Matteo and bring him to the estate. Put him in the basement. I want to look him in the eyes when I skin him alive." 14 agonizing days passed. For 2 weeks, Cassian lived in the sterile, beeping purgatory of Massachusetts General Hospital's ICU. He only left room 4 to shower, change clothes, and oversee the brutal, systematic dismantling of Matteo's loyalists in the shadows. Matteo himself had vanished the night of the gala, tipped off by a sympathetic ear in the ranks. Cassian had a $5 million bounty on his cousin's head. But inside the hospital, none of the Mafia politics mattered. Inside room 4, Cassian was just a broken man praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Jennett had begun weaning Camila off the heavy sedatives that kept her in the medically induced coma. Isabella sat in the corner chair, her rosary beads clicking softly between her fingers. Cassian was in his usual spot, holding Camilla's pale, fragile hand, staring at the steady, rhythmic spike of the heart monitor. Suddenly, Camilla's fingers twitched. Cassian inhaled sharply, leaning forward. Her eyelids fluttered, the heavy lashes brushing her pale cheeks. A soft, pained whimper escaped her lips around the endotracheal tube that had been removed just hours prior. Her chest rose in a jagged, painful breath. Slowly, agonizingly, her hazel eyes cracked open. They were cloudy, unfocused, darting around the dim room in panic before finally landing on Cassian's face. "Cass," she croaked, her voice barely a dry rasp, sounding like crushed glass. "I'm here. I'm right here, amore mio," Cassian choked out, tears instantly brimming in his eyes. He gently cupped her cheek with his warm hand. "Don't try to move. You're safe. You're in the hospital." Isabella rushed to the bedside, weeping openly, gently kissing the top of Camilla's head. "Oh, my sweet girl. My brave, beautiful girl. Thank God. Thank God." Camila blinked heavily. The fog of the anesthesia slowly clearing as the agonizing reality of her physical state registered. Her collarbone throbbed. Her chest felt like it was encased in concrete. But the worst pain was in her abdomen, a deep, hollow, aching fire that radiated through her very core. She swallowed hard, grimacing. Her hand, trembling and weak, slipped from Cassian's grasp and moved agonizingly slowly toward her stomach. She felt the thick layers of surgical gauze. She felt the flatness. Memory rushed back in a violent, merciless flood. The street-jewed gala. The waiter. The gun. The laser sight. Throwing herself over Isabella. The burning, tearing agony of the bullets. And then, the secret she had held so closely for 10 weeks. Camilla's breath began to hitch. Her eyes widened, frantic and terrified, searching Cassian's face. The monitors beside her bed began to beep faster, her heart rate spiking as panic set in. "Cass," she gasped, her voice breaking. Her fingers dug into the bandages over her abdomen. "Cass. The baby. My baby." "Where?" Cassian closed his eyes, a single, devastating tear cutting a path down his cheek. It was the moment he had dreaded for 14 days. The moment he had to break the heart of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. "Look at me, Cammy," he whispered, opening his eyes. They were completely shattered. He took her hands, pulling them gently away from her stomach, holding them tightly against his chest. "Did they?" Camilla sobbed, her whole body beginning to shake, aggravating her gunshot wounds. "Tell me. Please, Cassian, tell me." "Doctor." Jennett stepped into the room, alerted by the heart monitors. But he paused at the door, recognizing the heavy, sacred tragedy unfolding. "You lost a lot of blood, Cammy," Cassian said. his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. The bullet. It tore through your abdomen. It caused catastrophic damage. You were dying. Camilla let out a high-pitched, wailing keen that sounded like a wounded animal. It was a sound of pure, maternal agony that forced Dr. Janet to look at the floor and made Isabella collapse into her chair, sobbing into her hands. No. No, 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 Camilla wept, thrashing her head against the pillow, fighting against Cassian's grip. Please, no. I was going to tell you. I was waiting for Christmas. I know, baby. I know, Cassian cried, pressing his forehead against hers, his own tears mixing with hers on her cheeks. I am so sorry. I am so fucking sorry. But I can have another one, Camilla gasped, desperate, clinging to a thread of hope through her devastating grief. We can try again. When I heal, we can try again, right? The silence that followed was the cruelest sound in the world. Cassian pulled back just enough to look into her desperate, bloodshot eyes. He couldn't speak. He just slowly, agonizingly, shook his head. Camilla stared at him. The thread of hope snapped. They had to perform a hysterectomy to stop the bleeding. Doctor, Janet said softly from the doorway, stepping forward. I am so incredibly sorry, Camilla. It was the only way to save your life. The fight completely drained out of Camilla's body. She didn't scream this time. Instead, her hazel eyes glazed over, staring blankly at the acoustic tiles of the hospital ceiling. The tears flowed silently, continuously, pooling in her ears. The gentle, compassionate nurse who had loved healing people died on that hospital bed. The innocence was surgically removed along with her future. Cassian held her, whispering useless apologies into her hair for an hour until the sheer exhaustion of her grief dragged her back into a restless sleep. When she woke up the next morning, the room was empty save for Cassian, who was sitting in the corner chair staring out the window at the Boston skyline. His eyes were dark, ringed with purple exhaustion. Camilla turned her head. Her face was pale, devoid of the warmth that usually defined it. Her eyes were hard. Cassian, she croaked. He was at her side in an instant. I'm here. Who did it? She asked, her voice shockingly steady. It wasn't the voice of a civilian. It was the voice of a woman who had crossed over into his world. Cassian hesitated. It doesn't matter right now. You need to heal. Who? She repeated, a hard, unyielding command. It was my cousin, Matteo, Cassian confessed, the shame heavy in his chest. He wanted my mother dead to take over the syndicate. He hired the shooter. Camilla closed her eyes, taking a slow, painful breath. When she opened them, the hazel irises looked like polished steel. Find him, Camilla whispered, her hand reaching out to grip Cassian's wrist with surprising strength. Find him, Cassian. And when you do, you don't kill him. Cassian frowned, confused. Cammy, he took our child. He took your future. I know, Camilla replied, a chilling, terrifying calm settling over her features. That's why you don't kill him. You bring him to me. 6 months later, the Boston spring brought a cruel, mocking thaw to the city. The snow melted. Flowers bloomed in the manicured gardens of the Russo estate in Concord, Massachusetts, and life seemingly moved on. But inside the sprawling stone mansion, winter had taken permanent residence. Camilla Hastings was a ghost of the radiant nurse she once was. The physical wounds had scarred over into jagged, raised silver lines across her collarbone and abdomen, but the psychological mutilation was absolute. She rarely spoke. She no longer smiled. She spent her days sitting in the estate's greenhouse, staring blankly at the orchids. Dressed entirely in mourning black, Cassian remained fiercely devoted, practically tearing his criminal empire apart by the roots to find the man who had destroyed their future. On a humid Tuesday evening in late May, Cassian's phone buzzed. It was Leo. We got him, boss. Leo's voice crackled over the encrypted line, tired but triumphant. He was holed up in a shipping container in Providence, Rhode Island, trying to secure passage to Sicily. He's in the estate's bunker now. Cassian hung up the phone. He walked into the greenhouse, where Camilla was gently pruning a dying rosebush. He didn't have to say a word. She saw the lethal finality in his dark eyes and she calmly set down the gardening shears. The bunker beneath the Russo estate was a soundproofed, concrete vault originally built during the Cold War. The air down there was stale, smelling faintly of damp earth and old copper. In the center of the room, chained to a steel-reinforced chair beneath a harsh, single incandescent bulb, sat Matteo Russo. His designer suit was torn, his face battered and bruised from Leo's apprehension, but his eyes still held the arrogant, venomous spark of a man who believed his bloodline made him untouchable. The heavy steel door groaned open. Cassian walked in first, his presence commanding and terrifying, but Matteo didn't flinch until the figure behind Cassian stepped into the harsh light. Camila. Matteo's arrogant smirk faltered. She looked like an avenging angel carved from white marble and shadow. Her hazel eyes were dead, reflecting no light, no mercy, and no hesitation. Cassian. Matteo spat, blood speckling his lips. You bring a civilian down here to do your dirty work? Have you gone that soft? Cassian didn't answer. He stepped aside, allowing Camila to walk right up to the chained man. You shot Isabella to take the syndicate, Camila said, her voice a terrifyingly calm whisper that echoed off the concrete walls. That was business. But I need to know something, Matteo. I need to know why the shooter aimed low. Matteo looked up at her, a cruel, twisted realization dawning on his face. He let out a low, raspy chuckle that made Cassian reach for his weapon. But Camila held up her hand, stopping him. You think it was an accident? Matteo wheezed, coughing up a spatter of blood onto the floor. You think my guy just had bad aim? The temperature in the room plummeted. Cassian froze, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. I have eyes everywhere, Cassian. Matteo sneered, turning his gaze to his cousin, including the private clinic on Newbury Street. I saw the ultrasound billing records. I knew the nurse was carrying the next Russo heir. Isabella was just the excuse. The real target, the real threat to my claim, was incubating in her stomach. I told the shooter to make sure the bitch never bred. A suffocating, agonizing silence crashed down on the bunker. The cruelty of the confession was a physical blow. Cassian let out a strangled gasp, staggering back a step as the horrifying truth shattered him all over again. It wasn't collateral damage. The murder of his unborn child was premeditated. It was an execution. Even Leo, a hardened killer who had seen the worst of humanity, turned his face away, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. Tears of pure, unfiltered rage and sorrow burned in the underboss's eyes. Camila didn't cry. She slowly turned to Cassian and extended her open, trembling hand. Cassian understood. He unholstered his black, suppressed Sig Sauer and placed the heavy metal grip into her delicate palm. Her fingers wrapped around it. It was too big for her hand, but her grip was terrifyingly steady. She turned back to Matteo. He finally saw the reality of his situation. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening panic. Wait, Camila, you're a nurse, Matteo stammered, straining against the heavy steel chains, the metallic clanking echoing loudly in the vault. You save lives. You take an oath. You don't have this in you. Cassian, stop her. My oath died on that marble floor, Camila whispered, raising the weapon. She aimed it directly at his stomach. And you took my life before I ever got to meet him. Twip. The suppressed gunshot was deceptively quiet. Matteo screamed, a horrific, gurgling sound as the hollow point round tore through his abdomen. Twip. A second shot. Matteo's head slammed back against the chair. He gasped for air that his shredded lungs could no longer process. Camila lowered the gun. She stood perfectly still as Matteo's breathing stopped, his chin dropping to his chest, the arrogant cousin finally reduced to nothing but a corpse in a concrete room. The vengeance was complete. The scales were balanced, and then the gun slipped from Camilla's fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. The silence that followed was broken by a sound that tore the souls of every man in the room. Camila let out a devastating, soul-crushing sob. Her knees buckled. The cold, unyielding facade of the Mafia queen shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving behind only the grieving, broken mother. Cassian dove forward, catching her before she hit the floor. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her tightly as she wailed, her fingers digging desperately into his shirt. She cried for the baby she would never hold. She cried for the innocent woman she had been, the nurse who had spent her life healing, now stained irrevocably with blood. Cassian buried his face in her hair, his own tears falling freely, sobbing openly as he held the woman who had sacrificed her soul for his family. In the corner of the bunker, Leo wiped his eyes, mourning the complete destruction of a pure heart. They had won the war, but sitting on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by death and the echoes of a stolen future, everyone in the room knew they had lost everything that mattered. The underworld forever whispers of the nurse who took 5 bullets and rose as the Russo Syndicate's undisputed queen. Camila Hastings sacrificed her womb, her innocence, and her child to protect a bloodline she eventually ruled. Her hands, once dedicated to healing, now hold the heavy crown of Boston's darkest empire. A tragedy forged in blood, proving that the most lethal weapon is a mother's broken heart.